Hello everybody, I'm Kenneth Hamilton, I'm Head of School of Music, Cardiff University. I'm told that you've watched the video of the little concert I did last month for the students. Now of course it was on a much better piano than this small piano. That concert was in our main concert hall on the main Steinway Concert Grand. But I'm here just to talk to you a little about programme choices and to say a bit more about the pieces that I was playing. And of course when we're programming something, we basically try mostly, or at least I try mostly, to program for variety. Not just variety of mood, but also variety of key structure. So for the pieces in that short concert, I had basically the key structure was C minor. A rather sort of, varied and fairly aggressive piece. And then I actually chose the most contrasting key possible, or one of the most contrasting keys possible for the second piece. So the Schubert was G flat, so that the key sequence was. Now that was actually quite deliberate because I wanted the Schubert to sound like a sort of angelic consolation, like sympathy, something of beauty. So the Beethoven would end quite violently. So this sort of rather dramatic ending, and I wanted that to follow on with a sort of consolatory, angelic, nostalgic thing. So even though there's applause in between, I wanted the audience to have the C minor in their head. And then this to come in like this. Like that. Now, interestingly enough, that Schubert impromptu I just started playing there was also published in G major. So if I played in G major, I played in a different key, and you can hear the difference. Although since you're all musicians, you'll know anyway. But the end of the Beethoven, C minor, and now the impromptu in G. And now compare it with the G flat. So the effect of that last one is more dislocating because the key is much more distant, like that. But it also gives a greater impression of being out of this world, of being on another planet, which was the effect I was trying to create. And in contrast, the key sequence of the last two pieces, so the Wagner list. So if you end the Schubert impromptu, then the next piece, the spinning song from the Flying Dutchman, is just up a third. And then finally, D for the last piece. So the last two pieces form a dominant, effectively, a dominant and tonic connection. So I was thinking really of the whole thing as a narrative arc, harmonically and tonally. I was also thinking in terms of contrast of character. I mentioned that the first piece was fairly dramatic and violent. The second is sort of rather beautiful and romantic and elegant. And then the third was sort of jolly. So basically, fast and fierce, slow, elegant, consolatory, sort of jolly and dance-like. And then finally, the last one was basically an operatic aria. basically I was trying to get a sequence of moods or atmospheres or feelings that would make sense as a narrative, both harmonically and tonally, but also in terms of a dramatic sequence. And of course, as you'll have heard, the last piece sort of does end sort of rather brilliantly and magnificently. So the last piece itself is a transition from a much more quiet opening to a rather grand and grandiloquent conclusion. So I was basically thinking of the sequence of pieces like a little play, like a little story, like a little narrative, not a specific one about specific events, but an emotional narrative. So it seems to me that the difference between a concert program and just a random sequence of pieces, a concert program really has some sort of emotional story to tell. Maybe not a specific story in terms of specific events, but a story of a sequence of emotions. And we as performers should be leading the audience, try to lead the audience through these sequence of emotions by means of music. And so as well as this narrative and mood, I also wanted to some extent a narrative in historical chronology, a narrative in the age of the pieces played, and also pieces that use different piano techniques, even in such a short program. Now the first piece, the Beethoven Variations, was basically written for an old piano, for a piano really of around 1800, very different from a piano like this. This piano has a metal frame, really quite heavy keys, and quite a loud, brilliant, sometimes too brilliant, sometimes sound. Beethoven's piano was a lot smaller, had a wooden frame. The keys were much narrower, much lighter as well. And most of the actual action and playing in Beethoven's piano was really from the wrist and the fingers. So the big sort of sound that you get in romantic music, where basically you're pushing the upper part of your shoulders into the keys. That sort of technique is not really needed in Beethoven, and it would have destroyed his piano. It would have broken his piano to sort of use that amount of force. But of course, in a modern piano, you can do that. For Beethoven, of course, as we know, so we're mostly working from the hands and wrists, and you can even feel the narrower compass. Now, Beethoven's piano went roughly from here to here. So that entire area here and down here was not available to him, and you can feel it when you start playing this piece. So the chords are compact like this. And most of the figuration is within an octave. That's the first variation. So very, very little of the figuration extends over individual octave spans. I mean, if you compare the difference between that and Chopin and Liszt, where the average span is not an octave but a tenth. So the first Chopin study of the Opus 25 set, for example, as you probably know, so the natural left hand there is extending over a tenth. And likewise, the right hand starts on an octave, but then gradually extends a ninth. So that sort of technique was really unknown to Beethoven or for the piano players of Beethoven's day. So basically, the piano writing in the little program of the short concert expands from the Beethoven style writing, all in fairly close position. to the Schubert, which is still in Beethoven's day, but slightly more open. But Schubert rewritten partly by Liszt. So the opening of Schubert, which is Schubert's original, is still in the Beethoven octave span. So still octave chords, but the recapitulation, the repeat of that section as rewritten by Liszt is again tense. And this next bit is not just in widespread chords, there are also extra inner voices and the inner fingers. So that sort of technique where the chords are extremely widely spread and there are middle voices coming out in the same hand, it's really a much later technique for both the Beethoven and Schubert. That's how you know that that was rewritten by Liszt, because it's really a mid-19th century romantic style. So the Schubert-Liszt for me in that program was the transition between the Beethoven-Schubert style of writing into the Liszt-Wagner, which is of course all much larger, much heavier, much more extensive arpeggiation and writing, because basically by this time the piano was much wider. There were more notes, literally more notes. It was a heavier instrument, and the piano allowed a much wider variety of texture and a greater variety of individual part writing within the hand. So the program itself was also like a little conspexus, a little sequence of piano music from around 1800, from the style of 1800 to the style of about 1870, and followed that chronological order. So to summarize, this emotional narrative, but also historical keyboard technical narrative that's contained within that short program. So supposing we went further beyond the 1870s, which I didn't in that concert, but I obviously play music, as most of us do, much later than the 1870s. So when we get to the late 19th century, and the same is true with some of the more advanced works by Liszt as well, we have an even wider span of voicing in the piano, and we also have a much greater use of inner voices and inner parts. Especially obvious, for example, in the music of Rachmaninoff and composers around that time. So basically composers of the early to mid 20th century. I mean, we can hear it. I didn't play this piece at the concert, but if we listen to this Tchaikovsky lullaby arranged by Rachmaninoff, you can hear that most of it actually is a series of 3 or sometimes occasionally 4 different voices all coming out from the texture. So in other words, the main accompaniment is set up at the beginning, which is this interlocking account, baram, 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 with the left hand and the right hand really interlocking in syncopation. Now a new middle voice. again. And now the tune, which should sound like a singer. So at each point there's really 3 layers of texture going on. And if I carry on a little further, then the tune turns into the bass voice, or rather tenor. The tune will come in the middle. Accompaniment. Now tune in tenor voice. So we really have a gradual expansion of the piano's capabilities from effectively a melody and accompaniment texture like this to a much more orchestral, vocal, variegated texture where the voice, the main voice, the singing voice can be in virtually any part of the keyboard, and the accompaniment itself is divided into different voices. And so I think one of the biggest difficulties in piano playing is not actually playing the notes, but weighting the notes in such a way that each voice has independent line, as if you were a little orchestra or a little vocal quartet, and each voice was actually integral to its own musical texture that each voice carries on. So you ought to be able to listen to the piano and hear the logic in each voice in a slightly different tone color in the instrument. And that, I suppose, is one of the toughest things in piano playing, but one of the most rewarding things, because when you succeed in doing that, if you succeed in doing that, then you simply produce a much more interesting tone color. It's simply more pleasant, more moving to listen to. Yeah, how do I prepare for concerts? It's a rather interesting question. I think I prepared differently when I was a student from now that I'm a professional. I think it depends how big your repertoire is. If you have a large repertoire that you've been playing for years, then in your head you think about the repertoire that you have, whether there's any new pieces you want to learn, and you arrange it for a concert in your head in this sort of way. As a student, I was constantly learning new pieces. I still try to learn a lot of new pieces, but there was a point when I was a student when virtually every piece I ever played was a new piece. So I think that requires a different preparation. If I know a piece well, I can usually recover it. I can usually start playing it within an hour or two. If it's a very difficult, complicated piece, maybe 2 or 3 days to fully recover it. But the main thing, I think, is if you're playing from memory, is not to practice the piece with the music. If I'm trying to re-memorize a piece, I don't have the music in front of me, so I don't put the music here. Assuming that I once knew the piece and I'm trying to get it back in memory, I simply put the music down like that, so I can't actually see it, and I simply start playing the piece. And whatever the piece might be. carry on until I forget, so until I can reach a bit where I've forgotten, and then I will look at the music, I will understand, have a look at it, but I won't have the music in front of me, so that I will just then re-memorize the little bit that I've forgotten. And that's so that I never get used to playing with the music in front of me with a solo program, because then there's a psychological thing where if you always have the music in front of you, it's very difficult to then take the music away and play from memory. So basically, I always try from the perspective of always having memorized repertoire, even when I'm practicing it. So ideally, I will practice it from memory. And I got into the habit, I think, when I was about, I don't know, 15 or 16, where one of my piano teachers refused to listen to me play anything unless it had been memorized, which I thought was pretty tough at the time. But I now realize that she was simply trying to prepare me, which she did actually very well for a professional attitude and a professional career. Where whether you like it or not, and it's not historically valid, but it's the way the world works. Piano players are mostly expected to have their solo repertoire memorized. So I have to thank her for that she forced me into memorizing things. And then it became almost second nature to me, that I just, when I start playing a new piece now, I automatically start memorizing it. It just sort of happens, because I've got used to it. So what I would recommend is actually what my piano teacher did. My old piano teacher is basically always start out just from the point of view you're going to memorize this. So I'd never get used to having the sort of help, if you like, of the score. But when you're practicing it, of course, you will need to have the score to actually do the initial memorization. So that is really how I prepare. I prepare in a way that's all based on memorizing the music and then practicing, like we all do, individual sections of the music, but also on different pianos, because the music will sound different in each piano, and you have to have enough command of the music to be able to bring out your own interpretation, no matter what the instrument is. Also, the effect of an unfamiliar concert hall, unfamiliar instrument, really lessens the concentration. It's distracting. So the music really has to be very, very firmly in your head before it's really fully prepared. Anyway, so that's what I do. It doesn't mean that that's what you have to do, but I was always glad that I had a tough early teacher. Yes, I do listen to recordings of other artists. Almost always artists before 1945 or so. The reason being that 1945 was roughly when editing recordings became possible. So recordings, apart from piano rolls, but acoustic and electric recordings before 1945 are of necessity not edited. So they had to be recorded in sort of 3-minute sections. There was no other way. So in some extent, you're getting a more truthful, maybe truthful is the wrong word, a more of an imitation of a live experience, shall we say, than modern digital recordings, which, and now I make lots of recordings, and some are edited significantly, some aren't, but it's always possible to edit recordings in modern digital editing. You can edit individual notes and individual bars, and this was not possible before 1945. No editing, significant editing was possible. So I feel you're getting a more honest picture of how the pianist played at that time, and also a greater variety of different possible performance styles, because before the Second World War, before 1945, there wasn't so much of a general international uniformity of performance styles. It doesn't mean that I don't occasionally listen to contemporary piano recordings. I listen to my old recordings sometimes myself to remind myself how I played something. But I just find that the historical performance styles more interesting, possibly more inspiring. I think one also has to be careful to not unintentionally end up copying something directly. So even if you admire something, you should always use it as an inspiration, not as a thing to be copied. In other words, you use other people's playing to make your playing better. Don't use other people's playing to make your playing like their playing. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think recording repertoire and live performance repertoire are very different things. Really, very very different things. Because on a CD or on a larger recording, you really want there really should be a theme. I think something where the pieces have a certain coherence, and so you might have a CD of all Chopin or all Liszt or Rachmaninoff or whatever. You might want a CD of all. Many people record all the Beethoven sonatas, but would you really want to sit to listen to 7 or 8 concerts of all the Beethoven sonatas? Now I know people do this, and I know people sometimes do listen to it, but it seems to me that approach for concerts doesn't have enough variety. It's not quite varied enough. So what makes a coherent CD repertoire sometimes doesn't make a varied enough concert repertoire. The emotional moods of a concert are different from the emotional moods of a CD. It's also possible, for example, to have a CD maybe of entirely quiet, introspective, reflective repertoire that might eventually make quite a boring concert if this were to go on live for about an hour and 20 minutes. So I think the repertoire is very different. I think also if you're programming as a professional pianist, it can be quite difficult, because if you think, as I do, that the repertoire for CDs and the repertoire of live concerts are to some extent different, I know there will be overlap, then you have to have different parts of your life where you're mostly practicing and learning your recording repertoire, and other times when you're practicing for concerts. Now, I try never to record anything that I haven't also played in concert at some point. So it's not that the individual pieces won't have been played in concert, but it just means that the arrangement of the pieces together, what is played together, might be in a different arrangement, a different sequence of pieces. So, for example, my own schedule is I usually have a recording session at the end of January, usually a day or two, and then another recording session in sometimes 2 days towards the end of August, and very occasionally an extra day between these two periods. So these are times that I know I will have to be learning repertoire for recording, and in between times I will try to play some of that repertoire in live concerts as well, but it won't be in the CD sequence, because that probably won't give enough variety. So it can be quite difficult, because you're basically juggling 2 sets of repertoire, and then sometimes maybe a concert promoter will book you to do something that you weren't planning to record at all, and so that becomes quite difficult. But what at least I do try to do is make sure that if I have a series of concerts, that I only have maybe 2 concert programs on the go simultaneously at any one time, at worst 3. When I was a bit younger, I got this wrong an awful lot, and we'd end up with sequences of 6 concerts with completely different repertoire. So I've been less of an idiot in recent years, and I've started to try to rationalize things a bit better. But nevertheless, it's a balancing act. But it's easier if those pianists who think that the CD repertoire, in terms of sequence, should be identical to live performance, have an easier time, because then they can just do exactly the same thing. But I think there's a different type of coherence and a different type of narrative in recording and in live performance. So I try to follow that in my own performances. No, I think actually I became interested in older styles of piano playing, partly by chance, partly out of intellectual curiosity, partly because Ronald Stevenson, one of my teachers, was fascinated by, well, especially by Busoni, Ferruccio Busoni, the pianist composer, and Paderewski, and was fascinated by these older styles of players, and would often say, "Oh, you should listen to Paderewski playing this, or Busoni's piano roll of whatever." And I began to realize 2 things. One is that there was more variety, at least as far as I could tell, in the performance styles of the older pianists, partly because there was no way of achieving uniformity, multimedia, so the international media didn't exist in the same way. So people in France didn't necessarily know how people in the US were playing something, whereas nowadays you just have to go on the internet or listen to the radio of whatever. And the second thing I began to be interested in was if the instruments were very different, if the instruments for the instruments that people played then were very different, how does this affect the way we should perform this music on our own modern instruments? It seemed to be very difficult to think that even though we're playing this music, we're playing Beethoven or playing Mozart, whatever, surely the instruments that these composers and performers used must have a significant effect on how the music was intended to be interpreted and performed. So I began to get interested in this strange thing that basically about 80% of our repertoire is old music, is music of 100 years or sometimes 200 or 300 or 250 years. So this chronological disjunction between modern times, our modern instruments, our modern ways of doing things, and our really rather old repertoire. So I began to get interested not just in listening to early performers, but also reading treatises, reading books, reading information, just finding out how earlier performers and composers approach their own repertoire. And then, of course, I discovered that they approach it very differently in many respects from the way we do now. That for example, they applauded in the middle of pieces, and they would shout encore, they demand an encore in the middle of a piece, and it was a much more interactive experience with the audience. So I got interested in that, and I eventually wrote a book about it that I was very lucky that lots of people turned out to be interested in too. And so there's now an edition, and it's been translated into Italian, it's been translated into Hungarian, and there's an edition coming out in Mandarin very soon. So I'm very glad to see that so many people were interested in this book, because basically when I wrote the book, I simply wrote what interested me. So I was very pleased that it interested some other people as well. I mean, it was purely, shall we say, an attempt to educate myself into performing styles of the past. And the book was called in English after the Golden Age, Romantic Pianism and Modern Performance, but it was given different titles in different countries, translation, which I won't even try to pronounce. But I think I'm told that the Mandarin version is actually a very sort of direct translation. It's a very accurate translation. And I called it After the Golden Age because there was this myth that there was a golden age of piano playing, and we now no longer are in this golden age of piano playing. And I don't actually believe that, but I do believe that we have a lot to learn from the golden age of piano playing.